and Speaking Our Minds is one such book. It's a book about the evolution of language, and as well as being a conveniently sized Christmas stocking filler, it's also been hailed as the best book ever written on the evolution of a language. And those aren't my words. Those words come from Dan Sperber, the eminent cognitive scientist and philosopher. Thom Scott-Phillips is a name that I think we should all get used to hearing. I think we'll be hearing more from him in the coming years. And I'm absolutely thrilled he's come down today to speak to us. So let's please give a very warm welcome to Thom Scott-Phillips.
Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me? So first, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Paul. I wasn't expecting that. And thank you also to Palgrave MacMillan for publishing this book. It's actually been quite a smooth process from my point of view, so I'm very pleased about that. I think it looks very nice. I certainly didn't design the cover, but I think it looks great. So thank you very much, Palgrave. Okay, so context is critical to human communication. So take an utterance like, wait until all these people have gone and I'll get her out and have a good old fiddle. Now, what could this mean? So it means one thing if it's said, let's say, by Keane, a very shy violinist. You're at a party, too shy to get it out when everyone's there. Wait until everyone's gone, we'll have a good old fiddle. It means something quite different if you say it at a funeral. Now, this joke, I should give credit, it's not mine. This joke comes from a series of spoof lectures made for BBC Radio a few years ago. And in these lectures, Chris Addison talks about the human evolution, and he focuses on different aspects of human evolution in each lecture. And in one of them, he talks about the evolution of language. Now, obviously, he says lots of silly and funny things, but one thing he does stress, which is actually spot on about, is the importance of the difference between what is said and what is meant. The technical term in linguistics is underdeterminacy. What is said underdetermines what is meant. So what this means is that the information contained in what I actually say is not enough on its own to determine what I actually mean. There's something extra going on there. And I guess the central thesis of my book is that if we want to understand the origins of language, what we really need to understand first is the origins of a type of communication in which underdeterminacy is an inherent and inevitable and actually very good feature, because it allows us to communicate in all sorts of flexible and creative ways, and indeed very funny ways sometimes. And what I argue is that this form of communication is unique to humans, hence half of the subtitle, why human communication is different. And then once you've got that communication system in place, I'll talk about exactly what that is in a moment. Then on top of that, you put a whole bunch of conventions that we share as a community, which we call languages, the words and the rules that make up our languages. Okay, and in this talk, I guess I'm going to expand on that thesis in a few different ways. And the first of those will be to think about the very idea of what language and communication is in the first place. So, if you ask people, what is communication? How does communication work? What is this thing we call communication? An intuitive idea is something like maybe what you see in this picture here. So, you have a message and you package it up and you send it along some channel where it gets unwrapped. This is called the conduit metaphor. And this actually pervades our everyday language. We talk about get your message across, send me your ideas. Phrases like this which encapsulate this idea of the conduit metaphor. A very closely related idea comes from the work of Paul Shannon, a mid-20th century computer scientist, very early computer scientist, who was concerned with the idea of how do you transmit information across noisy digital networks. And so you get this information theoretical idea of communication. So what goes on here is you have some sort of information which just here is encoded by some algorithm, and then it's sent along the conduit, the channel. Maybe there's some noise comes into the system and it gets received, and then over here there's a decoding algorithm. And if this encoding algorithm and the decoding algorithm are appropriately calibrated to one another, and if maybe they've got some mechanisms in place to deal with the possible then what comes out at this end is exactly the same as what went in at this end, and we can say that communication has occurred and has been successful. As I say, this is a very intuitive way of thinking about how communication works. It's also a very intuitive way of thinking about how linguistic communication works. So we have these words, and they're like, we have these ideas, and we encode them in our words and our grammar, and then we speak them, and then you as receivers, you decode them. The problem is there's a long tradition in the philosophy of language which has actually argued that this way of thinking about linguistic communication doesn't quite work. So this is Wittgenstein on the left. It's a slightly grainy photo, it's quite old. And this is Paul Grice, who's a mid-20th century philosopher of language who really did a lot to articulate the problems with this approach. I like this slide because of the quizzical way they seem to be looking at each other. Which kind of emphasises the point that communication is not straightforward. Let's take a few very simple examples. So, I want that. So, kind of a trivial point, but an important one. What is that? Okay. It's not clear, just on its own. This utterance doesn't say much. You've got to do more to understand what somebody means. Animal. So this could mean, look at the nice fluffy bunny rabbit. It could mean, there's some dinner, go and catch it. Or it could mean, run away. Or one of many possible things. Take her to the bank. Or which bank? Is that a financial institution, or is it the side of a river? And then there's an interaction. Mary asked Peter, would you like to join us for dinner? And Peter replied earlier. Now, you all know what Peter means. What I want to point out here, though, is that on its own, Peter's utterance doesn't actually answer Mary's question. And the point I'm getting at with these examples is not the quite straightforward point that linguistic communication is often ambiguous. It's a more subtle point that languages on their own, as codes that could be encoded and then decoded by a receiver, languages are actually quite poor. In fact, they're useless at that job. If you just take the language as a code and don't add in context and understanding intentions and thinking about what other people want to communicate, you can't understand any of this. Just as a code, languages are quite useless. That's a point that, well, as I say, many people through the 20th century made. Paul Grice most famously. And Grice's work led to the advent of a subdiscipline of linguistics called pragmatics. So pragmatics is the study of language use in context. So if semantics is the study of meaning in isolation, pragmatics is the study of how that meaning works actually in a communicative context out there in the real world. Here's another book, the big book of language evolution, published a few years ago, 800 pages, big, fat thing. And this is the blurb from the back cover, and this blurb is accurate. I mean, it's actually a very good book in its sense. In this book, 60 leading scholars present critical accounts of every aspect of the field of language evolution. The book presents a wide range of summation of all the disciplines involved. As I say, you see, it's a representative. The contents of this book are representative of the field of language evolution. You go to the index and you look up the number of entries for different subdisciplines of linguistics, different topics that are relevant to the study of language in general and language evolution in particular. And what you find is that people aren't really thinking very much about pragmatics. Lots of work on thinking about syntax, semantics, and phonetics and other things. But not much work thinking about how we actually use languages out there in the real world in communicative contexts. One way of, sort of summarise the thesis of the book earlier, but another way of saying what the book is about is to say, well, what happens if we think about language evolution and take pragmatics seriously? If we put pragmatics front and centre, how does that help us understand where this very distinctive feature of humans actually comes from? And it turns out, I think, that the answer is we can understand quite a lot when we take a pragmatic perspective. Okay. So, first thing it can do is it can crystallise this question of actually what are we trying to explain? This thing that we want to understand, the origins and the evolution of. What is it? What are languages? So as I said earlier, one intuitive way of thinking about languages is in terms of code. And this idea is certainly it's pervasive, not just out, not just in a common intuition, it's how many linguists think about linguistic communication. I think when you talk to many linguists, they will certainly acknowledge the importance of pragmatics, but will then say, well, it's a justifiable simplification for methodological reasons to treat languages as codes and to study them on those terms, even though maybe they're not strictly speaking codes in the way described by the code model. But languages aren't really codes, so what are they really? And to answer that question, we have to look at these more fundamental, more basic forms of human communication. So 2 examples here. We point all the time. Pointing is a way of communicating with people. But we can actually use anything, any physical thing we can do, vocalizations and so on. So we can shrug. But we can also, I can twist my elbow in a certain way, and it may or may not be communicative. So a couple of examples. So I was in a coffee shop earlier today. I wanted a refill of coffee, so I made eye contact with the waitress, and I just did this. And she understands that I want to communicate. Well, she understands that I want to communicate with her and what I'm trying to communicate. Here's a more abstract example. A few weeks ago, I was in a pub with some friends. There's 2 of us at the bar, so we're both facing this way. And my friend just here has just been served a plate of chips, and we're talking away, and I had my hands out in front of me, so I was trying to get the barman's attention. And we're talking, and I just twisted my hand like this. So the chips were just here, and I just gave a twist to my hand. And my friend said yes. So I was requesting a chip, and he said yes. And the point is, I can do anything. Almost anything I do, I can actually turn into a communicative act by performing it in a certain way. I mean, there's no way that this is coded, the idea, can I have a chip? So there's a lot of other things going on here in human communication about understanding that people are trying to communicate with you and then working out what they're trying to communicate, which comes before language, it's the foundation on which language is built. The technical term is ostension, so I can just twist my hand incidentally, but if I twist it in this particularly exaggerated or stylized, deliberate way, it's ostensive. I twisted my hand in an ostensive way. And when you've got ostensive or pragmatic communication, languages are the bonus, they're the thing that come on top. So we've got this basic form of communicating with one another, and then languages allow us to use it in particularly powerful and expressive ways. So with a point, I can point to things in this room, but with words, I can point to things that are remote in time and space. With shrugs, I can express a handful of emotions and so on, but with words, I can express a much wider range of emotions and much more precisely. So language is a bonus, and in a way, this turns the intuitive idea on its head. So one intuition is that linguistic communication is made possible by codes. It's a code at the bottom, and then the pragmatic stuff, this flexibility, is the bonus that goes on top. Actually, that's entirely upside down. The foundation is the pragmatic stuff that makes communication possible in the first place. And the language is the bonus that allow us to make that communication much more expressive and more precise than otherwise would be. Now, what that means for evolution is that we've really got 2 problems. So on the one hand, we have to understand what this more fundamental form of communication consists of and how it might evolve. Do our primate relatives communicate in anything like this way? And on the other hand, we've got the question of, well, once you've got that type of communication in place, how do we as a community build the conventions, the words, the grammar, and so on, and how do we agree upon how they're to be used such that we can communicate in very precise, flexible ways? So if they're the 2 problems, the next thing is, well, how are we going to address those problems? And we're going to do them in, I guess, classic ways that you might do in cognitive science. So for the first question, we're going to make some comparisons. So in a moment, we're going to talk about experiments comparing the communicative abilities of infants, human children, and chimpanzees. And then for the second question, we can actually go into the lab and we can get adults to interact in ways which make, we can design games and experiments using these games in which people create new communication systems. We can observe how those communication systems change over time and start to develop the sorts of features that we associate with languages. So they're the next 2 things I want to talk about. Okay, so these are our closest relatives. We've got chimpanzee. here, baby bonobo, gorilla, and some orangutans. And in the last, I guess, 10 to 20 years, there have been a lot of experiments comparing, or a lot of work in general, looking at the cognitive abilities of our primate relatives, and in particular comparing them with human children. The reason we look particularly at children is because when it comes to tests of understanding the physical world, things like causation and where objects disappearing and understanding they're still there, even though you can't see them, and so on and so forth. Adult chimpanzees and human children perform roughly similarly on these sorts of tasks. What's interesting is that when you get into the social world, you start to see a lot of differences. But so the reason we're looking at, where we're comparing the chimps with the children, is that we know when we're looking at these social tasks, communication being a case in point, we know that any differences we observe aren't down to just standard differences in general cognitive ability, because we know that chimpanzees have similar cognitive abilities to children in all sorts of other domains outside of the social. So that if we do see differences, we know they're specifically about social cognition, of which, as I say, communication is a case in point. So what sort of experiments would we do? If we want to ask the question, do chimpanzees communicate in anything like the sort of fundamental ways I was talking about earlier, the things that contribute to pointing, shrugging, twisting your hand, ask for a chip, and so on and so forth. Obviously they won't be asking for chips, but bananas. Okay, so the most basic question we might ask is about, do chimpanzees and do human children understand that communication, this basic form of communication, is first and foremost about affecting mental states? So when I communicate with you, I may have, as some sort of more distant goal to change your behaviour in some way. But my immediate goal is actually to change your mental states, your knowledge, your intentions, your ideas, your beliefs, and so on and so forth. So if I try and communicate with you, and, well, let me describe a simple experiment, I'll get the idea across quite nicely. So in this experiment, we get the child into the room, and there's an experimenter on the other side of the table. And you get the child to make requests for certain objects. So if we look at this picture first, so there's a couple of objects behind the experimenter up here, and the child asks for the ball, and the experimenter says, oh, you want the ball? And she gets the ball, and she hands the child the ball. His behavioural outcome has been satisfied, everything's good. Okay. Well, not just his behavioural outcome, but it also, in this condition, he asks for the ball, which says, oh, you want the paper? I'll give that to you in a moment. And then she incidentally happens to give him the ball. So the difference here is that here, well, in both cases, the child's material goal has been satisfied. The child wanted the ball, the child got the ball. But only in one of these did the child get the ball because the adult understood that the child wanted the adult to understand that the child wanted the ball. That's that one there. In this one, the adult did not understand that the child wanted the adult to understand that the child wanted the ball. That's just a happy accident. And the question is, well, do the children complain? So their material goal has been satisfied. So if the goal of child communication is just to get your material goals, we should see these two things should look very similar. The child should just be very happy in both cases. But it turns out that's not the case. In this condition, children start to complain. No, I wanted the ball, and we've got the ball, but I wanted you to understand that I wanted the ball. The children demonstrate in their subsequent behaviour that they understand that communication is about affecting mental states, first and foremost. The behavioural outcomes are then follow on. I'll talk about chimps more in a moment. I want to talk about a couple other experiments before I do. So pointing. So let's turn this around from production to comprehension of communication. So in that last experiment was about a child communicating with somebody else. So in other experiments, people have looked at whether you can detect what I called earlier ostensive behaviour. So we can point, but we also sometimes points appear incidentally because I happen to be looking at my watch. And one of these, this is just incidental, but this is communicative. Do children understand the difference? Can they pick up on the difference between the incidental point and the ostensive point? So to to test this, you can get the children into the laboratory, but it's been done in a variety of ways, but here's one. You get the child in and you play a game, lots of toys around, and then you pack up the toys. You turn the packing up the toys into a fun game. But one of the bits has been accidentally left out, and the child is just putting the box away, and then the adult points at the box. But the adult points in one of two different ways, depending on the condition. So either the adult points at the box with a deliberate point and looks at the child. So this is the communicative situation. In the other one, they just point at the object, but incidentally because they're looking at their watch. And only in the first of those conditions do the children then actually go and get the object that they're pointing at. And what this shows is that the children can detect the difference between behaviour that is meant to be communicative and behaviour which, although superficially very, very similar, isn't meant to be communicative. So this is children showing, these are, I guess, criteria for identifying this basic form of communication, ostensive communication. One last one, an experiment of my own. So the idea is a little bit more complicated, but it's quite fun and sneaky. So imagine you're at a polite dinner party. You finished your glass of wine, and you would like more wine, but it would be impolite of you to ask the host directly for more wine. So you wait until the host has turned her back or left the room, and you move your empty wine glass from the corner of the room to the middle of the table, more conspicuous location. And you wait for her to turn around, and she fills your wine glass up. We call this hidden authorship. So you provided a stimulus for somebody, you provided the information, but you've hidden the fact that it was actually for them. You didn't want them to understand if you moved the wine glass, so that they would understand that you wanted more wine. And this is interesting because it's a sophisticated variant on what we actually do all the time in communication. So in this case, I have an intention that you don't understand that I have an intention that you understand I want more wine. And what's normally going on if you get into the theory of ostensive communication in detail is the same thing but without that conflict. So it comes back to that child wanting the adult to understand that the child wanted the ball. You get all these embedded layers of intentions and so on. Hidden authorship is a nice way of getting a particularly sophisticated variety of this. So I was lucky enough to, a few years ago, to spend some time at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. We did an experiment on hidden authorship. First thing I should say, so I'm going to show you a little video, a very short video of what happened. First thing I want to say is this child is a lot older than the children we actually tested. So this is from the pilot studies. So this child, I think, is 7 at the time, but the children we did the experiment were 3 and 5. So here's what happens. First experimental one. So this barrier here is the same as this barrier just here. So the child is actually sat just down over here. Experimental one, and the child enters the room first, and they come across this box just here. And this box has 4 holes in it. And these holes are shaped like certain toys. So one of them might be a tractor, one is a hat, and so on and so forth. One is a ball. So you can see what sort of objects you're after. So they can now play a game. Well, let's find the tractor, let's find the ball. And they go and find all the objects. And then experimental one says, well, experimenter 2, she really likes this hiding and finding game as well. So we need to put the objects back where we found them so she can play the game as well. So they do that, and now the child knows where all the objects are hidden. And in particular, they know that the ball is hidden just behind this barrier here. It's just there. And then experimenter 2 comes in and says, oh, I really like the hiding and finding game. I want to find all the objects myself. And then she says one of 2 different things depending on the condition. She either says, oh, I don't like it when I can't finish the hiding and finding game. I really like this game. I don't like it when I can't finish it. And in another condition, she says, I really like this game, but I don't like it if anybody helps me. I want to do it on my own. So in one of these conditions, effectively the child has been given permission to help the adult, and in the other one they haven't been given permission. So then experimenter 2 starts looking around for the objects, finds a couple of them. So she's found the hat already and one of the others, and she's looking for the other object. Oh, where is the ball? I can't find the ball. I've looked here. And she spends quite a bit of time with her back to the child, so she can't see the child. And the question is, what's the child going to do? The child knows that the adult doesn't want any help. The child knows where the ball is, and they can reach the ball. It's just there. What are they going to do? Watch the boy. Watch the boy in the corner. turn around and go, oh, why didn't I see that earlier? It was always there. Okay? The point is that the boy has provided the signal or provided the stimulus for experiment 2 without actually making it apparent to the experimenters that's what they were trying to do. It's actually a very sophisticated form of ostensive communication. And as I say, we did this in 3- and 5-year-olds, and they do it too. They're not quite as good as this 7-year-old. Right? So they do things like they go, not sick. But nevertheless, that's interesting because it shows that they understand the difference between providing the information for someone and actually communicating with them. Now, what about chimpanzees? So we've got these experiments, and there are several others in a similar vein. Nobody's done comparable experiments with chimpanzees of the sorts that I've just been talking about. Not exactly the same. And I think there are 2 reasons for this. One is that they're really hard. So trying to design methodologies that are similar to those ones, but you can do with a chimpanzee, you can't use language in any way. It's not straightforward. But it's probably not beyond the wit of experimenters to do it for at least a couple of them, particularly the first one, I think, where we'll press them on. There should be a way to do that if people wanted to. But my view, and this comes from speaking to a lot of people at the Max Planck Institute and in other places, is that there's generally a step that amongst that community of people looking at cognitive differences between humans and primates, there's a lot of skepticism that any chimpanzee is going to pass any task like this. So my provisional conclusion is that the chimpanzees are not communicating they don't use ostensive communication. They don't employ the form of communication which we see as fundamental, the pointing and shrugging and so on. Now, that conclusion could be overturned with the sort of evidence I've just been talking about. So if you can design experiments of this sort for chimpanzees and do the comparisons with children, it would be possible to overturn that conclusion. I'm sceptical that that's the case because I don't think the chimpanzees are communicating ostensibly. Hence the subtitle of the book, Why Human Communication is Different. But maybe somebody can make a counter argument. Okay, let's move on to the other part of the subtitle now. So human communication is different. The other part of the subtitle is how language evolved to make it special. And the evolution I'm talking about in this case is more cultural. So it's not the biological evolution of humans, it's the evolution of languages themselves. How do languages come to take on the sorts of properties that we recognize as being linguistic? So perhaps the most basic property of all is that languages are arbitrary or symbolic. So some signs, they have what we call an iconic relationship to the thing they refer to. So the sign on the front of the toilet, the man or woman, it looks like the thing it's referring to. It has a physical resemblance of some sort. Some things are indexical, so indices don't have a physical resemblance to the thing they refer to, but they have a causal relationship. So dark clouds are indexical of rain. They don't look like rain, but they have a causal relationship with rain. And then the third class of signs here is symbols, and that's what we see in language. So a symbol doesn't have either a physical or a causal relationship to the thing it refers to. The link is entirely arbitrary. We could agree as a community to just switch the words for cat and dog around, and then cat would mean canine animal. Is that right? You see where I'm going. And this is certainly not a point that's original. This quotation is from Romeo and Juliet. And Juliet is lamenting the fact that Romeo's surname is Montague, but her point is these things are arbitrary. Labels are often arbitrary in language. And you can see the origins of this arbitrariness if you look at a lot of writing systems around the world. So too, Eastern languages, you can see that these words start off quite iconic. So this looks like a gate. This looks somewhat like a woman. But over but over the course of time, so this is time, so these are original forms and these are the more modern forms. And this doesn't look at all like a gate, and I would agree with you that this does not look like a woman. Okay. So we can see in writing systems the emergence of this really basic feature of languages. And we can actually look at this in the laboratory as well. So people have done it in various different ways. The easiest to present are experiments that kind of based on the game Dictionary, which I'm sure many, perhaps all of you have played. And this is two people communicating the concept of cartoon. So originally, they draw something, I guess it looks like a cartoon. And as they play the game several times, repeatedly over and over, it starts to take on a more arbitrary form. And you can imagine that over time, this is going to look more like an M, perhaps, as if you were to play it more and more. So now a little bit of audience interaction. Similar kind of experiments, a Pictionary type game. 24 concepts that they're going to communicate in this game. This is from round 6, so it's been through several iterations of people playing. Which of these concepts does this refer to? Anyone? Toothbrush, amazing. That's what my friend said yesterday. Their tooth was wrong. Sorry? Theatre? Correct, yeah. Nice. So it's theatre. Sorry. Okay. And this happens in minutes. We're talking about 20 minutes in the laboratory. So something that starts off as iconic starts to become very arbitrary very quickly. So it starts to become possible to imagine how words can start to originate. There's a little anecdote in my book about how when I was a teenager, I went on some family holidays to France. And my uncle would go to the local delicatessen in the morning to get family breakfast. My uncle is of a generation he never learned foreign language at school, had no interest in learning one. So he gave up on trying to use French very early in his trips. He would just go in there and go, "Moo!" Now that's iconic. There's a physical relationship between sound and this, and what he wanted to order, which was two pieces of meat. What these experiments show is that that sort of behaviour can become arbitrary, can become symbolic very quickly when people start to use it over and over again in communication. And then you can start to stick these words together. So here's 3 cases where we start to see what communication looks like when we just start to stick things together before languages have evolved too much of a lot of the structure that we associate with more developed languages. So this is from what we call a pidgin language. So this is translated into English, an interaction in a pidgin language between a Norwegian and a Russian sailors they're bartering for flour, for goods. So there's Russian and Norwegian are not much like each other, but this community they come into contact and they negotiate. They agreed upon negotiated words for some basic concepts, and they started to stick them together. And what you can read here, so there's not much in the way of grammar. The word order is not fixed. There's not very many grammatical words. There's mostly competent words. But you can still understand more or less what's going on, even without any more details of the context. Another place where you can see these words being stuck together in simple forms is the language of toddlers, 1 and 2 year olds. And also in language-trained chimpanzees, they stick 1, 2, 3 word sentences together. But there's not much grammar in there. In the jargon of linguistics, there's a lexicon, but there's very little grammar. So they're sticking words together, but in a more or less unorganised fashion. So we can start to see how languages are beginning to build up here. Now I want to add to the mix. So we're seeing how languages have been built up in communication through interaction. Now what I want to add to the mix is learning. So languages languages do not only have to be useful for communication, they also have to be learnable because we've used them, and then our children, they need to acquire this language too, and if it's too complicated, they're not going to acquire it. So what happens when we add learning to the mix? So I won't go into the details of this experiment because it gets quite involved, but just very quickly, an experiment done in Edinburgh where I did my PhD some years ago. So you get participants into the lab and you train them on an artificial language. So in this case, this is going to be a language of 27 different meanings. So there's 3 possible shapes. There's squares, circles, triangles. There's 3 possible colours. There's black, although that looks more grey on this screen, but black, blue, and red. And then there's three possible types of movement. We've got this one, I think one of them is swirly, I can't remember the third one, but you've got 3 by 3 by 3 reading space, and the participants are trained on 27 totally random words. These words don't have any bits in common, so they're not organised, they're not structured in these languages. and then you can manipulate the conditions in various ways, but essentially what you're aiming to do is to get languages used in communication, but also the participants have to learn the language. So you're trained on this language, and then you use it in communication. And then whatever language you've used in communication is then the training data for the next person who comes into the lab, or the next pair of people who come into the lab. And then they use it in communication, and whatever they did actually use is then the training data for the next person. So you get the language needing to be used for communication and also for learning. And although it starts off with totally random words, what you end up with is something that's very structured. So the hyphens have been added here so you can see what's going on. So although there would be random words, luku, kikumari, whatever you want, they end up having the linguistic terms morphemes for each of the different parts. So it's not completely structured, this language, but it's mostly structured. So the N's refer to the black objects, the L's to the blues, the R's to the red ones. Pilu refers to the objects that have this movement, plog to this, and key to these ones, and the middle morpheme refers to the shape. So you start to develop structure when the languages need to be used for communication and also for learning. If you only use one of those two things, then the language adapts only to that one. So if you don't have any communication, the language just kind of collapses into 3 words for 27 different kind of useless for communication. Very, very learnable. To have just 3 words in the whole language, but kind of useless for communication. And if you just have communication, then the language just stays very 27 distinct words with no relationships between them. But when the language needs to be used for communication and also has to be learned by each new generation of participants, then you start to get the structural features. And that's really where I think the exciting work in language evolution in the coming years is going to be. It's going to be looking at, so communication and language are big things that languages need to be, adapted to do. But there are lots of more subtle things that they need to do. And getting to those in more detail is where language evolution research is going to go, I think, in the next 10 years, 10 to 20 years, I guess. So 2 recent examples. Languages, there are certain features of languages. Some languages are tonal. So tonal languages are those where meaning changes depending on the tone in which you pronounce the word. So English is not tonal, it's an alien concept to a native English speaker. But Mandarin Chinese, most native speakers, all languages in the world, that's tonal. So the same word pronounced in 2 different ways has 2 different meanings. And it turns out that there are some genes involved in brain growth, with the existence of those genes in the world correlates with the existence of tonal languages. So what's going on here is that the languages seem to be adapting. So the hypothesis that this research, this one here, suggests is that those individuals with those genes, their brains, have a small preference for tonal languages. Anybody can acquire a tonal language. If you don't have the genes, you'll still be fine growing up in a community with tonal languages. But if the community at large generally has a preference for tonal languages, then the languages will adapt to fit that preference and you end up with tonal languages. This one here is about the physiology of the eye and the way that the fact that we have rods and cones that are particularly sensitive to certain colours shapes the way that we label the colour spectrum of possible colours. So, generally speaking, it's a lot more complicated than I'm about to make it out to be, but generally speaking, the world, speakers of different languages of the world will agree on what's prototypically red and blue, but they won't agree on what's prototypically brown or orange and so on and so forth. And there's more work. This is a great experimental study pointing in the direction of the fact that we've got certain, our eyes are built in certain ways explains why you get those distributions, or why we label the colour spectrum in the way that we do. Okay, time to start. If there's a central point to speaking our minds, it's emphasising the importance of communication, and particularly the fact that the way we communicate without language is really fundamental to thinking about what language is and the thing we're trying to explain. Underdeterminedness is crucial to understanding what it is we're trying to explain, and indeed the answers that we're looking for. So we can do the comparisons with chimpanzees and infants, and what we find when we do is probably no other species communicates in the way that we do, hence why human communication is different. And then when you look at what communication does when people start to interact with each other, how interaction in communication starts to build conventions, you can actually observe this process in the lab, and you can start to see how the features that we associate with languages start to emerge through interaction. And that's, I think, there's a lot more detail to be done on that story, but that's a really exciting place for language evolution research in the coming years. Thank you very much for your time.
Behaviour to indicate something that isn't verbally indicated?
Yeah, okay. So, all sorts of different types of communication out there in the natural world. Give you one example. When you look at those in detail, what you find is they're more like codes. So, a certain type of behaviour will trigger a certain type of response. In fact, let's go back. A certain state of the world will trigger a certain signal, which you're describing, and a signal will trigger a certain response, which would be that's the story there. The point about extensive communication is that there's no state of the world that tells me that the right thing to do to ask for a chip is to do this. This is, no. I'm not saying so well. Let me start here. Right, okay. Here's a different way of getting at it. What makes that type of communication possible in the first place? Okay. And the answer is mechanisms of association. So the organism, and the animal in this case, can associate the state of the world with the production of a certain signal. So you can divide, so natural selection can create organs that associate the state of the world with a certain signal, and then similarly reception of certain signals with certain responses. That way of mechanisms of association don't make linguistic communication possible. That's kind of the Gricean Wittgensteinian one we saw earlier. So there's no associations between this and asking for a chip, or whatever else it might be. So what makes this possible, this other type of communication possible, are mechanisms of social cognition, thinking about others' minds and mental states. Okay, so you can describe the sorts of communication you're talking about in very simple language, in codes, in terms of association. You can't do that to describe what happens in linguistic communication. And that's why it's different, because what makes it possible in the first place are mechanisms of social cognition, about thinking about others' mental states and so on and so forth. And that's really the difference. Does that come make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Let me enjoy that. So thinking about this sort of continuum from being very easy, very communicative to being very easy to learn, do you think that we'll ever sort of move in the direction of any of these constructive languages that are kind of optimized?
Yeah, right. Interesting question. I guess, I'm not familiar with any particular constructed language, but I do understand that when people construct them, they start complaining when they change. When people use them and they change. I'm guessing the reason they change is that they're not actually optimum for the various things that languages need to be. And it's not just learning and communication, they're two headline things. There's all sorts of other things going on. And yeah, that would be a nice place to do research on how languages change everything.
Any more questions? Right, anyone wants to pick up a copy of Speaking Our Minds
mind, you can just come over to us, might get it signed even. And I think we have to say a big thanks to Tom for a really fascinating talk.